The street had no name that history troubled to keep, only a row of shuttered houses leaning toward each other across a lane too narrow for two donkeys to pass abreast. And at the far end of it, under a sky scrubbed clean of moon by a hand of cloud, a young man walked with a purse of gold pressed hard against his ribs beneath his cloak, listening for nothing but the sound of his own sandals on the packed earth, and even that sound he tried to still. This was Patara, a harbour town on the Lycian coast where the Mediterranean came up green and cold against the rocks, a town of shipwrights and grain merchants and, in this particular house, a man who had once been counted among them, and now was not. Nicholas knew the house. He had passed it 100 times as a boy running errands for his mother, had known the man who owned it when that man still owned something worth the name, a modest fleet, a warehouse of oil and cloth, 3 daughters born in quick succession and raised, for a time, in the expectation that fathers of means allow themselves, that each would marry well, that each would carry into her husband's house a dowry sufficient to make the match honourable. Then the ships were lost, or the debts came due, or the harvest failed twice running. The record does not trouble itself with the mechanism of a poor man's ruin, only with its shape, which is always the same shape, in Patara or anywhere else. A man with daughters and no gold is a man staring into a particular kind of dark. He had heard, this father, that other cities kept other remedies for daughters nobody would dower. He had begun, in his desperation, to speak of those remedies aloud, to friends, to his own daughters, weeping as he said it, that he saw no other road left to him than to sell what innocence they had to whatever buyer the harbour offered. That starvation was no less a sin than shame, and a father must choose between 2 evils when a good God, it seemed to him, had left him none. Nicholas heard this the way the whole of Patara must eventually have heard it, through the porous walls of a small city where grief travels faster than bread, and something in him that had been waiting for a task now found one. He had, by this time, no mother and no father of his own to answer to. Epiphanius and Nonna had raised him in this same town in comfort and in unmistakable devotion, had seen him baptized, and had watched, even in his boyhood, a gravity in him that made the old women of the parish nudge one another when he passed. Both had died. The record gives no distance between the 2 deaths worth arguing over, only that they came close together in one of the plagues that moved through the Lycian coast like weather, and left their only son heir to everything they had. A lesser heir spends such an inheritance on the appetites. An orphan's grief makes reasonable. Nicholas instead seems from that hour to have regarded the gold as a kind of standing question put to him by God. What will you do, now that you can do anything? He answered it that night with his feet on a dark street, moving toward a house he had no business approaching after the hour when honest men were abed. He did not walk to the door. A knock at the door announces the knocker, and Nicholas wanted, above every other consideration, not to be known. He came instead along the side of the house where a window stood open to the sea air, unshuttered because the family that lived behind it owned little enough that thieves had long since stopped considering them worth a visit. There, in the dark, Nicholas drew the purse from beneath his cloak, heavy enough to serve as a dowry for the eldest daughter, weighed and prepared beforehand with the same care he would one day bring to the weighing of doctrine at Nicaea, and let it fall through the opening. It struck the floor within with a sound too solid to be mistaken for anything but what it was. Gold, in quantity, landing on stone. He did not wait to hear what followed. He was already moving back along the wall, back into the lane, back into the ordinary dark of a town asleep, his heart going hard in his chest, not from the exertion of the walk, but from something nearer to what the saints call fear of the Lord. Not terror, but the trembling attention of a man who has just done a true thing, and knows it. Behind him, in the house, a father was waking to a sound he could not place, was rising from his pallet, was finding at his own feet on the floor a purse that would answer, in a single stroke, the ruin he had been composing for his eldest daughter. We are not told, and need not invent, what that father said into the dark of his own house. The tradition of the Church has never required us to supply the words of every witness in order to trust the event. What the Church has kept, across 17 centuries of divine liturgies and vigils and icons painted in gold leaf from Kiev to Bari, is the shape of the thing itself. A young man, newly orphaned, newly rich, walking at night through a poor quarter of Patara to give away what he had inherited to people who would never know his name, because he had resolved, before he ever lifted the purse, that they should not know it. That resolve is the hinge on which the whole of Nicholas turns. Any wealthy man of late antiquity might be persuaded, by a priest's urging or the weight of custom, to endow a dowry publicly, to have his name read out at the wedding, to receive the family's gratitude and the city's good opinion in the same generous stroke. Nicholas wanted none of that transaction. He gave in secret, at night, through a window, precisely so that no gratitude could reach him, so that the gift would remain, in the fullest sense, a gift, offered to God rather than banked as credit against the good opinion of men. This is not a detail added later for the charm of it. It is the entire theology of the act. Christ had said that the left hand should not know what the right hand does, and Nicholas, decades before he wore a bishop's pallium, was already living that verse in the dark streets of his own hometown. The eldest daughter was married that season, her dowry supplied from a source the family could only wonder at and thank God for, in the plain and total way that poor people thank God when disaster lifts. But a father with 3 daughters watches his gratitude curdle back into dread soon enough, because 2 daughters remained, and no purse had come for them, and no reason existed to think one would. Some weeks passed. The old fear crept back into the house the way damp creeps back into walls after a single dry season. And then, on another night as dark as the first, Nicholas came again, along the same wall, to the same window, and let fall a second purse, heavier or lighter we cannot say, only that it was sufficient, and the second daughter was married as the first had been, in wonder and in silence about the giver. It is the third night that the Church has always loved best, because it is the third night that lets us see, if only for a moment, the face behind the gift. The father, by now, was no fool. Twice a stranger's gold had found his floor in the dead of night. He resolved that a third gift, if God in his mercy sent one, would not slip away from him unseen. He kept watch. Night after night he sat wakeful near that window with the patience of a man guarding the one door left open between his family and ruin. And on the night Nicholas came a third time, purse in hand, moving as carefully as he had moved twice before. The father was ready. The moment the gold struck the floor, he was up and through the door and into the lane before Nicholas could vanish back into the dark that had sheltered him twice already. He caught him. Whatever words passed between them in that lane, and the earliest witnesses to this story did not trouble to invent dialogue where none had been preserved. And neither were we. The father knew, the instant he saw the young man's face by whatever light the night afforded, exactly whose household he was looking at, and fell down before him. He is remembered as falling at Nicholas's feet, weeping, calling him his saviour, and the saviour of his daughters, trying to kiss his hands as one kisses the hands of a bishop or an emperor. And Nicholas, mortified at being seen, more mortified still at being thanked, raised him up at once and begged him, in the plainest terms a man can use, to tell no one. Let this remain, he asked, between the two of us and God, who alone deserves the thanks for it. Whether the father kept that vow to the letter, history does not record. Clearly, at some point, enough of the truth escaped for the Church herself to receive it and keep it, or we would not have it now to tell around a fire in Advent, or read aloud to children with their stockings hung expectantly by a cold hearth. But the asking is the whole man. He did not merely happen to give in secret, as a shy man might give reluctantly, uncomfortable with praise. He gave in secret as a discipline, as an offering deliberately hidden so that it could not be corrupted into reputation, and when the secret was in danger of breaking, his first instinct was not embarrassment for himself, but concern that the purity of the gift be preserved, even in its discovery. This is why the Church has never treated the story of the 3 daughters of Patara as a charming legend fit only for December windows and gilded picture books. It is kept, in the East and in the West alike, as the seed event of an entire sanctity, the single hidden act in which the whole of Nicholas the Wonderworker, Archbishop of Myra in Lycia, Holy Hierarch, and defender of the faith at Nicaea, lies folded already, the way an oak lies folded in an acorn. Every later mercy attributed to him, the sailors pulled from drowning seas at his intercession, the falsely condemned men spared the executioner's sword by his intervention, the starving city fed from grain ships he persuaded to spare a portion of their cargo, without any loss to the imperial ledger that awaited them. Every one of these carries the same signature discovered first on that dark street in Patara: mercy that does not wait to be asked, generosity that does not linger for gratitude, a hand that gives and then disappears into the night, rather than stand in the light to be admired for giving. It is worth pausing on the ordinariness of the means. He did not work a miracle to save the daughters of Patara. He did not multiply loaves or calm a storm. He opened his own inheritance and gave it away with his own hands, at considerable personal risk of exposure and no personal profit whatsoever, 3 times, until the household was entirely restored. The wonder here is not supernatural in the way that later wonders would be. It is the ordinary wonder of a young man choosing, deliberately and at cost, to be nobody in his own act of rescue. And it is this ordinary wonder that makes the extraordinary ones that followed believable. The Church did not first meet Nicholas working signs, and only later learn he had a good heart. She met the good heart first, in a dark lane in Patara, and only afterward, across a long life of episcopal labor and confessorial suffering, watched what Christ chose to do through a heart so shaped. Centuries later, sailors far from Lycia would paint his icon on the walls of their ships and pray to him before a crossing. Centuries later still, families in lands whose names Nicholas never heard would leave gifts by night for their children to find in the morning, without quite remembering, most of them, why the giving must be secret and why it must happen while the house sleeps. But the Church remembers. She has never let this feast become mere custom, emptied of its author. Every year, when a gift is left where no name can be attached to it, when a debt is paid anonymously, when a poor family finds provision at the door, and no one steps forward to be thanked, there, quietly, is Patara again. There is the window, and the gold, and the young man already moving back into the dark, before anyone can turn to see his face. That is where this story begins, because it is where his own character begins to be visible to us, not in a council chamber defending the divinity of Christ, not in a prison cell enduring the last great persecution of the Church, not even at his own consecration as a bishop, but on an ordinary night in an ordinary Lycian town, with a purse of gold and a father in despair, and a young man who had already decided, before God alone as his witness, what kind of life his inheritance would purchase. The priest at the font in Patara had baptized many children, and he knew what an infant does in the water. It startles, it cries, it must be held upright by careful hands or it slips beneath the surface within moments. But the child brought to him that day, the only son of the merchant Epiphanius and his wife Nonna, did something he had never seen. Set into the font, the infant Nicholas rose to his feet. He stood there unassisted, upright in the water, for the better part of 3 hours, as though some strength not his own were holding him steady before the altar of God. The congregation that had gathered for the baptism fell silent watching it. Nonna wept. Whatever this child was going to be, it was already clear to everyone standing in that church that he did not belong wholly to his parents, however much they loved him, and however much wealth stood ready in the warehouses along the harbor to make his life an easy one. He belonged, from the very hour of his washing, to God. To understand what happened to that boy, you have to understand the town he was born into. Patara in the early years of the 4th century was no backwater. It sat on the southwestern shoulder of Lycia, at the mouth of the Xanthus River where it meets the Mediterranean, and it was one of the busiest ports on that whole southern coast of Asia Minor. Ships from Alexandria and Rhodes and the Cilician coast rode at anchor in its harbor, and its lighthouse, built under Nero generations before, guided them in past the sandbars at night. It had a theater carved into the hillside that could seat thousands, baths fed by warm springs, a grand colonnaded street running down to the water. It was, in short, a place where a man with ships and warehouses and the right connections could become very rich, and Epiphanius was such a man. He and Nonna were Greek by blood and Christian by conviction in a province where the old gods still had their temples and their feast days, and their faith was not a private hobby folded away from public life. It was the center of the household, the reason the servants were treated with unusual gentleness, the reason the poor at their gate were never turned away with nothing. For a long time, though, that household lacked the one thing Epiphanius and Nonna wanted most. They had no children. Years passed, the ships came and went, the warehouses filled and emptied, the fortune grew, and still there was no son to inherit any of it, no daughter to be given in marriage to seal an alliance with some other merchant family of the coast. In a world where a childless couple was often quietly pitied, where barrenness was assumed to be either a private grief or a public judgment, Epiphanius and Nonna did what devout people in that world had always done with such a sorrow. They prayed, and they did not pray as men and women haggling with heaven for a convenience. They prayed the way Hannah had prayed at Shiloh centuries before, weeping before the Lord and promising that whatever child was given her would be lent back to him entirely. They asked God for a son, and they told him plainly, before the child even existed, that if their prayer was answered, the boy would not be raised for the counting house. He would be raised for the altar. God is not slow to hear such a prayer, and Patara received the answer in the birth of a son, the parents named Nicholas, a Greek name built from Nike, victory, and Laos, the people. Victory of the people, or perhaps, as the Church would come to understand it over the centuries that followed, the victor for the people, the one who would win battles on their behalf that they could not win for themselves. Nonna, some of the old accounts remember, was in hard labor when he came, and the moment of his birth was itself remembered as a small wonder amid her pain, as if the child, even in being born, was already announcing that his life would not run along ordinary lines. Whatever the precise details, one thing every strand of the memory agrees on. This was a boy conceived in prayer, born in answer to a vow, and given a name that meant something before he had done a single thing to earn it. The wonder at the font was the first public sign that the vow had been serious. But it was not the last sign, and what came after was, if anything, stranger still. Infants nurse whenever they are hungry, without regard for the calendar, and no household in Patara would have thought twice about a child fed at his mother's breast several times a day, every day of the week. Nicholas would not do this. From his earliest infancy, on Wednesdays and on Fridays, the 2 days the church had marked from ancient times as days of fasting, in memory of Christ's betrayal and his crucifixion, the child nursed only once and refused the breast for the rest of the day, however Nonna coaxed him. A household servant might have called it strange feeding habits in any other infant. In this one, raised in a home that watched for such things because it had prayed for exactly such a child, it was received as exactly what it looked like, an infant already keeping the fasts of the church in his own small body, before he had any capacity to choose it, before he could have known what a fast even was. He was, quite literally, given to God before he could give himself. You would expect a boy raised under such signs to grow up strange, remote, difficult to love. He did not. What the parish of Patara remembered of the growing child was not a solemn little ascetic frightening the other children in the agora, but a boy unusually attentive to the things of the church, drawn to scripture the way other boys his age were drawn to the theatre below the Acropolis, or the games in the gymnasium. Epiphanius and Nonna made sure their son was educated as thoroughly as their wealth allowed. He was taught his letters, taught to read the Septuagint and the Gospels in the Greek he had grown up speaking, taught the Psalms until he could recite whole sections from memory. And while other boys of good family in a Roman provincial city were expected to spend their idle hours at the spectacles the town was so proud of, the pantomimes, the athletic contests, the noise and colour of Patara's public entertainments, Nicholas showed little taste for any of it. He preferred the quiet of the church building, the company of the clergy, the long unhurried hours a devout household kept for prayer. His parents did not have to force this on him. They had prayed for a son given wholly to God, and God, it seemed, had given them exactly that, a boy who wanted, on his own, the very things they had promised he would want before he was even born. It is worth pausing on this, because it matters for everything that came after. Nicholas was not a rebellious rich boy who renounced the world after some crisis of conscience in adulthood, the way certain saints of the desert had done, walking away from banquets and inheritances in a dramatic turn against the life they had been given. His path ran the opposite direction. He was formed toward holiness from his mother's womb, shaped by parents who had already surrendered him before he drew breath, marked by wonders at his own baptism that told the whole congregation of Patara what kind of man was being made. When the turn eventually came, and it did come, hard and suddenly, it was not Nicholas turning away from the world his parents had built. It was God removing that world from around him, so that the boy already given could be given completely. Patara sat on a river delta, and river deltas in the ancient world bred fevers the way harbors bred ships. The exact nature of the illness that swept through the town in Nicholas's boyhood is not recorded with a physician's precision. The records that survive from that era rarely give such details even for far more famous households, but the effect on this one household is remembered with total clarity. Within a short span of time, first Epiphanius and then Nonna were taken by the fever. Nicholas, who could not yet have been more than a young man, not yet ordained to any office in the church, found himself standing in a house full of imported furniture and Egyptian glass and ledgers, recording ships and cargoes, with both of the people who had prayed him into existence now gone into the earth. It is easy, reading a life 16 centuries removed from our own, to move past a sentence like that too quickly, to let both parents died of a fever pass as a mere plot point on the way to sainthood. It should not pass so quickly. This was a real boy in a real house on a real harbour, and the quiet that must have settled into those rooms after the mourners left, the wondering what to do with his father's ledgers, his mother's loom, the private grief of an only child, suddenly alone in a house too large for one, was as real as any grief the reader has known. Patara did what a Roman provincial town of that century did for such a family. It mourned properly, it observed the customs, and then it turned back to its harbour traffic and its theatre and its ordinary business, because towns always do. But one household in Patara did not simply move on. Nicholas's uncle, his father's brother, also named Nicholas, who by then held the office of Bishop of Patara itself, took the boy in. This is the hinge on which the whole chapter turns, and it deserves to be understood plainly. A wealthy orphan in the Roman world had options, and none of them required the church. He could have been placed under a guardian who managed the estate until he came of age, and then released both fortune and freedom to him, to spend on a household of his own, a marriage arranged with some other merchant family, a life of comfortable civic prominence, exactly like the one his father had built. Patara had guardianship laws for precisely this situation, and a boy with Nicholas's inheritance would have found no shortage of relatives and family friends eager to administer it on his behalf, expecting nothing more than the ordinary gratitude such service earned. His uncle, the bishop, could have simply been one guardian among several, content to see the boy grow into his father's trade. He was not content with that, and neither, evidently, was Nicholas. The elder Nicholas, bishop of that same city where his nephew had been born, stood upright in the font and fasted before he could speak, took the orphaned boy not merely into his household, but into the life of the altar itself. He began to form him as clergy are formed, not with ledgers and shipping contracts, but with the discipline of the sanctuary, the long hours of the divine office, the careful study of scripture beyond what any tutor for a merchant's son would have thought necessary. Tradition remembers that the uncle bishop had the boy tonsured a reader, one of the earliest steps into the clerical state, entrusting him with a role in the liturgy of Patara's church, carrying the sacred texts, chanting the appointed portions, standing near the altar, rather than in the nave with the rest of the congregation. It was, in the plainest sense, the church claiming him formally for the office his parents had already claimed him for by prayer and vow before he was born. What happened to the inheritance during these years matters too, because it is not a detail the reader can set aside for later. It is the very fortune that made possible the deed for which Nicholas is now known before almost anything else about him. The gold dropped through a window into the darkness of a poor man's house to save 3 daughters from ruin. That gold came from somewhere. It came from Epiphanius's ships and warehouses, from a fortune that could have bought Nicholas a life of ease and civic standing in Patara, or any port city of Lycia he chose. His uncle did not seize that inheritance from him, did not administer it away into the church's own treasury, and did not pressure the boy towards some vow of total poverty on the day he came of age. He did something harder and wiser than either of those options. He raised Nicholas to want of his own free will, to give the fortune away himself, in God's time and by God's prompting, rather than have it taken from him or hoarded by him. That is the difference between an heir stripped of his inheritance and a son formed to know what an inheritance is truly for. Nicholas would spend his father's gold, but he would spend it as a bishop learns to spend everything entrusted to him, not as an owner, but as a steward standing before the one who gave it. By the time Nicholas reached the years when other young men of Patara were settling into trades, taking wives, assuming their fathers' places in the harbour trade, he had already been formed into something else entirely. A young man of the altar, versed in the scriptures, disciplined in prayer, standing near his uncle at the liturgy in vestments, rather than merchant's dress, carrying a family fortune he had not yet decided what to do with, but already knowing, in the deepest part of himself, to whom it truly belonged. He had been given to God before he could choose it, at the font, in his mother's womb, in a vow spoken before his birth. Now, orphaned and grown, the choosing was finally his to make, and Patara, and all of Lycia after it, would soon learn exactly what he chose. The ship out of Patara ran with cargo bound for Alexandria, oil probably, and grain and whatever else Lycian merchants sent south across open water in the sailing months. And among the passengers was a young priest few of the crew would have looked at twice. He carried little, a change of clothes, some money for alms along the way, and a hunger that had been building in him since the night he first counted out 3 purses of gold into a dark window and walked home alone under the stars. Nicholas had given away his inheritance to the poor of Patara, as much of it as anyone yet knew about, and now he meant to give the rest of himself to God in the oldest way a Christian of his century knew how, by going to the desert. Egypt in the 4th century was full of a fire that had nothing to do with the sun beating down on the Nile Valley. Anthony had gone out into the wilderness beyond the river a generation before and had not really come back, and by the time Nicholas made his crossing, the deserts west of the delta and out past Nitria and Schetis were dense with men who had done the same. They lived in caves and cells of mud brick, in the abandoned quarries the pharaohs had left behind, wearing the world down to nothing so that nothing would stand between them and God. Word of them had travelled the whole Mediterranean rim by then, Palestine, Syria, Cappadocia, the Aegean Islands, and South Lycia too, where the coast faced Egypt across a few days' sail, and the ships went back and forth constantly with grain and rumour both. A young man freshly ordained, freshly bereaved of both parents, freshly rich with a fortune he had already decided not to keep, would have heard those stories the way other young men heard stories of Rome or of the games at Antioch. He would have wanted to see for himself, so he went. and the crossing nearly killed everyone aboard. The Mediterranean does not announce itself gently in the autumn months, and a storm rose on that voyage the way storms rise there still, fast, black-bellied, out of a sky that had given no warning. The sailors who worked that route for a living would have known the signs and feared them anyway. A Roman-era grain ship was no match for a real gale, and everyone standing on the heaving deck that day understood exactly how thin the wood beneath their feet really was against the sea. The waves came up over the rail, the mast groaned. Men who had crossed this water 100 times began, by every account that has come down to us, to make peace with drowning. Nicholas did not join them in despair. He turned to prayer instead. The same instinct that had sent him out to that beggar's window at midnight now turned toward the heaving black water, and he called on Christ to still it. This is the part of the story that, later ages, uncomfortable with a young priest commanding the sea the way his Lord once had on Galilee, tried softening into metaphor. The church never did. The tradition is plain and unembarrassed. The storm quieted at his word. Whatever fury had been driving those waves broke apart under the weight of his prayer, the way it had broken apart once before under different feet on a different sea, and the ship that should have gone down that day sailed on toward Egypt instead. But the storm had already taken its toll before it yielded. A sailor working the rigging furling canvas, most likely, in the worst of the wind, the kind of desperate work that keeps a ship alive in a gale, lost his footing and fell. He struck the deck, or the mast, or the water. The details vary by the telling, but the outcome does not. He was dead. Not stunned, not merely injured, dead, in front of a crew already half convinced they were all about to join him. And Nicholas would not let it stand. He knelt over the man's body the way he would kneel, decades later, over the bodies of the condemned in Myra, and he prayed with the same fierce, unhesitating confidence that had just quieted a sea. And the sailor breathed again. He opened his eyes on a deck slick with rain and salt water, and looked up at a young priest he likely did not yet know by name. And he lived, not merely revived, but restored whole, as if the fall and the death and the terror of it had all been undone at the root. This is why sailors the world over would one day carve his image into the prows of their ships and paint him on the walls of harbour chapels from Bari to Novgorod to the docks of old New Amsterdam. It did not begin as legend attached to a beloved memory. It began on that deck, in that storm, with a body that should have stayed dead and did not. The ship made Alexandria eventually, battered but whole, and Nicholas stepped onto Egyptian soil already carrying something he had not carried when he boarded. The knowledge, given to him now by his own hands and not merely by report, that the God he served did not require him to choose between mercy and power. He could ask for both in the same breath. He would spend the rest of his life doing exactly that. What he found once he went inland toward the monastic settlements confirmed everything the stories had promised, and then went past them. The desert fathers of Egypt were not curiosities to be admired from a safe distance. They were living rebukes to every comfortable Christian who had assumed that faith could be practiced at half measure. Men who had once had households, trades, even wealth like his own, had walked into the wilderness with nothing, and had found there, in the silence and the heat and the endless repetition of the Psalms, a nearness to God that made every other ambition look thin by comparison. Nicholas walked among them, prayed with them, likely ate the bread they baked and drank the water they hauled up from wells dug with their bare hands. And something in him, the same something that had already given away a fortune in secret rather than let it soften him, recognized in these men a kindred fire. He began, we are told, to think seriously of staying, of shedding his priesthood back in Lycia, the way he had shed his inheritance, and disappearing into that country of sand and prayer for good. It would have been, by every human measure, a reasonable ambition for a young man of his gifts. The desert asked nothing of a man that Nicholas was not already prepared to give. He had buried both parents. He had no household of his own to abandon, no wife, no children who needed him more than God did. The uncle who had raised him and ordained him, the bishop of Patara who had first seen in his infant nephew the shape of a vocation, was aging but not gone. Lycia would not collapse without him. Every practical obstacle that keeps most men from vanishing into holiness had already, providentially, been cleared from his path. He could have stayed in Egypt. Many good and holy men who crossed that same water in that same century did exactly that, and the church is rich for their staying. But Nicholas was not finished with his pilgrimage, and Egypt was not the whole of what he had come to see. He turned north and east instead, toward Palestine, toward the land where the ground itself had been walked by God. We do not have, and do not need, a detailed itinerary of every stop he made. The tradition gives us instead the shape of the thing, A young priest moving through the towns and roads of the Holy Land, the way a starving man moves through a house, finally full of food, unable to pass any of it by. Bethlehem, where the cave of the Nativity had already, within a few Christian generations, become a place of pilgrimage and prayer. The actual ground where Mary had laid her son in a feeding trough, because there was no room anywhere better. Nazareth, where the ordinary hills of Galilee had once held an ordinary house, with a door the angel Gabriel had passed through. The Jordan, where the water still ran cold and green, and a man could stand in the current and remember that this same river had once parted around the feet of God made flesh, the Spirit descending like a dove, while the Father's voice broke the sky open. Jerusalem above all, the city that had killed its own Messiah and had never since that day been able to stop weeping over it, or rejoicing over it, sometimes in the same hour. And at the center of Jerusalem, Golgotha, the place of the skull, where the wood of the cross had stood, now enclosed by Constantine's new basilica, marble and gold, laid over ground, still holy with blood no marble could ever cover over. Nicholas would have walked those stones only a few years after the great Empress Helena herself had walked them, searching for the true cross. In the very decade the whole shape of Christian pilgrimage to the Holy Land was being invented in real time around him. He was not visiting a museum. He was standing in a construction site of glory, watching the church build shrines over wounds that were still, in every sense that mattered, fresh. It is here that one of the loveliest details of the tradition comes down to us, small and unprovable by any document, but cherished all the same by the memory of the church. That Nicholas came one night to pray alone at the church built over the tomb of the resurrection, and found the great doors shut and barred against him, as they would have been shut against any pilgrim arriving after the hour when the keepers locked up for the night. And the doors opened for him anyway, not by any human hand. They simply gave way before him, as if the tomb itself recognized a man it would one day, in its own turn, need to give something up for, though that recognition lay decades in Nicholas's future and centuries in Bari's. He went in and prayed through the night at the very stone where the angel had once told two frightened women that the one they sought was not there, that he had risen, exactly as he said he would. Whatever passed between Nicholas and that empty tomb in the dark hours of that night, the church has never claimed to know in detail, but it kept the story anyway, because it rings true to everything he became. A man for whom locked doors were never quite as final as they looked. It was somewhere in the course of this pilgrimage, the tradition does not fix the precise moment, only the substance of it, that Nicholas made up his mind fully to stay in the East. Not in Jerusalem itself, perhaps, but in the desert beyond it, in some cell carved from Judean rock, where he could spend the balance of his life the way the fathers of Egypt spent theirs, hidden, silent, entirely given over to contemplation. He had touched the ground where Christ was born, and the ground where Christ died, and the ground where Christ rose. And something in a man who has done that does not easily want to go back to ordinary life, to synods and property disputes, and the grinding daily administration of a Lycian church. And this is where the voice came to him. The church remembers it not as a vision full of trumpets and light, but as something quieter and more interior. A conviction that settled into him with the unmistakable weight of a command, telling him plainly that the desert was not where God wanted him. Return, the voice said, to your own country. There is a flock waiting for you that the wilderness does not have. If you wish to bear fruit that will last, go back to the world you have known, and be a shepherd there. It cannot have been an easy word to receive. Every instinct that had drawn him across the sea and through the desert and into the shadow of the Holy Sepulchre was now being turned back on itself, redirected toward the ordinary province of Lycia and the ordinary town of Patara, and, soon enough, toward a sea he did not yet know would be his. The desert had shown him what total surrender to God looked like when it was stripped of every distraction. Palestine had shown him the actual ground of salvation, the dirt and stone where the incarnation and the passion and the resurrection had each, in their turn, become historical fact rather than only doctrine. And now that same God was telling him that all of it, the fire of the fathers, the nearness of the holy places, the night in the empty tomb, had been given to him not to keep for himself in a cave, but to carry home and spend on other people. He obeyed. This, more than the storm and more than the desert, may be the truest measure of the man the pilgrimage produced. A lesser soul, having tasted that kind of nearness to God, might have argued with the voice, or delayed, or found reasons why the desert vocation was after all the higher one and Lycia could wait. Nicholas turned around instead and went home. He came back across the same sea that had nearly drowned him, changed in a way that had nothing to do with sunburn or the miles behind him. He had learnt in Egypt that holiness could be total, that a man could give every waking hour to God and hold nothing back. He had learnt on that storm-wrecked deck that mercy and power were not opposites, that a priest could plead for a life and expect God to grant it. He had learned in Palestine that the ground itself could be holy, that faith was not an abstraction floating somewhere above history, but a set of facts rooted in actual dirt a pilgrim could kneel on and touch. And he had learned, hardest of all, that God sometimes answers a man's deepest longing for solitude with the word no, because the world needs shepherds more than it needs hermits, and some men are called to carry the fire outward rather than guard it in a cell. He landed again at Patara, with that fire lit in him for good. Lycia did not know yet what was coming back to it across that water. But the boy who had once counted out gold in secret and the young priest who had once stilled a sea were about to become, within a very short span of years, something the province had not seen in living memory, a bishop whose mercy and whose ferocity would both, in their own seasons, become legend. The church at Myra was dark when Nicholas pushed open its door, dark enough that no one saw him enter. It was his habit, in those years after his return from Egypt and the Holy Land, to pray before the other clergy arrived, alone in the nave, kneeling on stones still cold from the night, waiting for the first grey light to find the windows. He had no reason to think anyone was watching him that morning. He had every reason to think no one was. But the bishops of Lycia had gathered the day before to choose a new archbishop for the see, and they had not been able to agree. Myra needed a shepherd. The old archbishop was gone, and the flock could not be left untended in a province already restless under Roman suspicion of the church. So the eldest among them, a man whose years had earned him the right to be believed, told the others what he had seen in prayer, that God would show them the one he had chosen, and that the sign would be simple. Whoever came first through the doors of the church for the morning office, and whose name was Nicholas, was to be made bishop that day. They kept watch, and the first man through the door, before the bell had even rung, was Nicholas, a layman still, by the world's reckoning, though no one who knew him would have called him one much longer. He had come, as always, to pray unseen. He left instead, seized gently by hands that would not let him go, brought before the assembled bishops, and asked his name. When he gave it, the elder bishop wept. Nicholas protested. By every account that has come down to us, he protested hard, the way a man protests who has spent years learning to want nothing for himself, who has walked the desert roads precisely to burn ambition out of his own heart. It did him no good. The church does not always ask a man whether he is ready. Sometimes she simply lays her hand on him and tells him he is chosen, and lets the readiness come after, in the labor itself. So Nicholas of Patara became Nicholas, Archbishop of Myra in Lycia, a holy hierarch before he had fully finished becoming a man of prayer, though in truth those two things were never separate in him. Myra was no great capital. It sat on the southern coast of Asia Minor, a market and harbour town backed by cliffs riddled with the rock-cut tombs of an older Lycian world, its port at Andriaki, a few miles off, where the grain ships and timber barges came in from the sea lanes. It was not Antioch or Alexandria. It was, for that reason, exactly the kind of sea where a bishop's daily life is not hidden behind the machinery of a great church, where the people know their shepherd's face, his walk, his hours, because they see him every day. And they did see him every day. The Nicholas who governed Myra was not a man behind closed doors administering from a chair. He walked the streets of the city and the docks of Andriaki. He sat with fishermen and grain merchants and widows who came to the church door with nothing. He heard confessions before dawn and settled disputes between neighbors before noon. And it was said of him, as it was said of very few bishops of that age, that no one who came to him in real need went away with an empty hand or a hardened word. He fasted, as he always had, but he fed others first and last. The gold he had once slipped through a poor man's window in Patara had not been a single act he then set aside. It was the shape his whole priesthood took, quietly, over and over, in a city that came to know its bishop as the one who noticed what everyone else pretended not to see. He visited the sick without being sent for. He went to the prisons, and Myra, like every city under Rome, had its prisons full of the poor, the accused, the forgotten, men held for debts they could never pay, men held on charges no one troubled to prove. Nicholas went to them not as an official making a required visitation, but as a shepherd who believed, in the marrow of his bones, that Christ himself had said, "Whatever you did for the least of these you did for me," and had not qualified the promise by asking whether the least of these were guilty or innocent, deserving or not. He fed them. He argued for them before magistrates when argument would help, and when it would not, he simply stayed, so that no man in that city's prison could say he suffered utterly alone. It was into this daily rhythm of feeding and visiting and governing that the famine came. The harvests along that coast of Lycia failed. The record does not linger on the cause, only the consequence, and the consequence was a city running out of bread. Granaries emptied. Prices climbed past what a fisherman or a stonemason could pay, and then climbed past what anyone but the wealthiest merchant could pay, and then there was simply no grain left to buy at any price. This is the particular cruelty of famine in a port city. The sea that should carry relief instead carries indifferent ships past a starving harbor, bound for someone else's table. Myra watched its children grow thin and did not know where deliverance would come from. It came, as Nicholas' mercies so often did, through a door no one thought to watch. A fleet of grain ships put in at Andriaki, riding low in the water, their holds loaded with wheat bound for the imperial granaries. Some accounts say for Constantinople, others for Alexandria's onward trade. But every account agrees on the essential fact: this grain was not meant for Myra. It was cargo under seal, weighed and recorded before it ever left its home port, owed in full to the Emperor's stores at the other end of the voyage. For the ship captains to give any of it away was, in the plainest terms, theft against Rome. A crime with real penalties attached. The kind that could cost a man his ship, his freedom, his life. Nicholas went down to Andraki and asked them for it anyway. He asked for a portion of the wheat in each ship's hold, enough to feed his starving city through what remained of the winter, and he made the captains a promise that had nothing ordinary in it. That if they trusted him and gave what he asked, they would arrive at their destination and find the weight of grain in their holds exactly as it had been recorded when they set sail. Not a measure short. The imperial officials who checked the cargo against the manifest would find nothing missing, no discrepancy to punish, no theft to answer for. It was an extraordinary thing to ask a hardened sea captain to believe, and by every trace of the tradition, some of them did believe it, moved, the accounts say, less by the bishop's argument than by something in the man himself, a certainty that did not belong to ordinary persuasion. They unloaded what he asked. Nicholas saw the grain carried up into the city, distributed to the granaries, measured out to households that had been counting the last of their flour by the handful. Myra ate. The famine that should have hollowed out a whole population instead broke against a bishop's insistence that God's arithmetic was not bound by Rome's scales. And when those ships completed their voyage and the imperial officials weighed their cargo against the manifest, they found the full measure. As promised, not a portion missing. The gift given and yet somehow not subtracted. Wheat that had fed a starving city and still arrived whole at its destination. The tradition remembers this as the wonder it plainly was, not the eloquence of a bishop persuading frightened sailors to break the law and hope for mercy, but the direct intervention of God multiplying what had been given away in trust. The way 5 loaves once fed 5,000 and left baskets over. Myra's granaries, filled from that gift, are remembered to have sustained the city for 2 full years, with grain left over even to sow the next planting. A famine broken not by trade or by tribute, but by a bishop who walked down to a harbor and asked, in Christ's name, for what by every worldly reckoning was not his to ask for, and received it. This is why the church calls him Wonderworker, Thaumaturgos, not as an ornament to a pleasant legend, but as the plain, sober name for a life in which the miraculous kept breaking through the ordinary, because the man himself had made so little room for anything but God's will. The grain miracle is remembered beside the dowry gold for exactly this reason. Both are the same mercy and different clothing, the same refusal to let need go unanswered simply because meeting it cost something. Money in one case, law and safety in the other. But the years of Nicholas's episcopate were not only years of harvests failing and ships answering prayer. They were also years in which the empire itself turned against the church with a violence it had not shown in generations. In the year 303, the Emperor Diocletian, urged on by his co-ruler Galerius, launched what the church remembers as the last and worst of the great persecutions, edicts ordering the destruction of churches, the burning of scriptures, the arrest of clergy, and eventually a demand that every Christian offer sacrifice to the Roman gods or die. It reached every province of the empire, Lycia among them, and it reached the Archbishop of Myra as surely as it reached the humblest believer in his flock. Nicholas was arrested. He was not a man who could be quietly overlooked. A bishop known across his province for his charity and his plain refusal to bend was exactly the kind of figure the persecutors wanted broken publicly, as an example to everyone still wavering. He was imprisoned, and the tradition of the church does not soften what that meant. He bore chains, he was beaten, he was held in conditions meant to grind a man down slowly rather than kill him quickly. The particular cruelty Diocletian's officials favored, understanding that a martyr's death could make a hero, while prolonged suffering in a cell, unremarked and unrelieved, might simply make a broken old man of someone the church had once called Wonderworker. It did not break him, whatever the physical suffering, and the record leaves it mostly to our imagination, sparing us details it does not supply, the way the earliest lives of the confessors so often do. More interested in the fidelity than the wound, Nicholas held to his confession of Christ through the whole span of his imprisonment. He did not offer the sacrifice demanded of him. He did not renounce his flock, his priesthood, or his God to purchase his release. The years of the great persecution ran on, brutal and grinding, until the political tide of the empire itself began at last to turn, until Constantine's rise and the Edict of Milan in 313 finally ended the campaign of state violence against the church, and the prisons that had held so many confessors of the faith were opened. Nicholas walked out of his cell into a world that no longer demanded his death, carrying in his own body the marks of what he had endured, and carrying in the church's memory a title almost as old as Wonderworker, Confessor, one who suffered for Christ and was not required to die to prove it, but who might as easily have died as lived, and chose neither comfort nor apostasy but simple, unspectacular endurance. It matters that this suffering came before the great public battle for which he is remembered even more vividly, the council that would gather at Nicaea a dozen years later, where he would stand against a heresy threatening to hollow out the very faith he had just finished suffering to keep. A man does not arrive at that council as he arrived at his ordination, untested and unformed. He arrives having already been asked, in a Roman cell, whether Christ was worth his life, and having already answered yes with his body before he ever answered with his voice in a council hall. The city of Myra, meanwhile, had not forgotten what its bishop had done for it before the persecution came. The grain that fed them through famine, the daily mercy that never asked whether the poor deserved it, the man who had walked its docks and its prison cells with the same unhurried attention. When Nicholas returned to them from prison, worn and marked but unbroken, they received back not a stranger transformed by suffering into someone new, but the same shepherd, deepened. He had always fed his flock before he fed himself. He had always given what was asked of him, even when giving cost more than he could safely spare. Diocletian's chains had only proven, in the hardest way possible, what Andreaca's harbour and Patara's darkened window had already shown, that this was a man who would break for no one and no threat, but who would give everything, freely, the moment love asked it of him. The hall in the imperial palace at Nicaea was not built for silence, but silence is what fell when the Bishop of Myra crossed the floor and struck the priest of Alexandria across the face. 318 fathers of the church sat or stood along those walls in the summer of 325, and every one of them had a story of what the years of persecution had cost him. Paphnutius of Egypt walked with an empty eye socket where a Roman blade had taken it. Paul of Neocaesarea could not lift his hands to bless, for the irons of Licinius had burned the sinews in them. These were not soft men gathered to argue fine points over wine. They were survivors, and Nicholas of Myra, whose own body still carried the marks of a Diocletianic prison, was one of them. He had not come to Nicaea to debate. He had come because the faith he had been beaten for was now being reshaped by a priest with a gift for verse, and a talent for making heresy sound like humility. To understand why a bishop who fed the starving of Myra with his own hands, and gave away his inheritance without so much as letting the poor see his face, would rise from his seat and cross a crowded hall to strike another man. You have to understand what Arius was actually saying, and why it mattered more to Nicholas than his own reputation, his rank, or even, in that terrible hour, his own freedom. Arius was a priest of Alexandria, learned, ascetic in appearance, beloved by a portion of his flock for his eloquence. He had built his teaching on a single proposition that sounds almost reasonable if you do not listen closely: that the Son of God, the Word through whom all things were made, was not eternal in the way the Father is eternal. There was, Arius taught, a time when the Son was not. The Father alone was truly unbegotten, truly without beginning. The Son was the first and greatest of the Father's creations, exalted above every other creature, but a creature nonetheless, brought into being out of nothing, like everything else that exists, only earlier and higher. It is easy, 17 centuries later, to hear that formula and think it a matter for scholars in a lecture hall. It was not. If the Son was a creature, however exalted, then no creature had ever bridged the gulf between God and man on the cross of Calvary. If the Son was not truly and fully God, then the whole of the Church's worship, every prayer offered in his name, every soul baptized into his death, every believer who called upon him for salvation, was worship offered to something less than the living God, and the promise of salvation itself was built on sand. Arius was not proposing a variant hymn. He was proposing that the God who had fed 5,000 from 5 loaves, who had walked out of the tomb on the third day, who had heard the prayers of a bishop starving in a Lycian prison and answered them, was in fact a magnificent creature standing at some distance from the throne, and not the throne itself. Nicholas had spent his whole priesthood, his whole life, since the day his parents dedicated him before he could speak a word of his own, learning who this Christ was by feeding his poor, ransoming his captives, and standing in a cell for his sake with his back raw and his joints swollen. He had not survived the great persecution to hear a priest from Egypt explain, in polished Greek, that the Lord who kept him alive in that cell was somewhat less than God. The controversy had already split the Eastern Church wide open by the time Constantine, newly master of the whole empire after his victory over Licinius, decided he would not tolerate a fractured Christianity in a realm he hoped to unify around the cross. He summoned bishops from every province at imperial expense, a summons so extraordinary that men who had never travelled beyond their own province in their lives now found themselves riding the cursus publicus toward a lakeside town in Bithynia, put up in palace lodgings, fed at the emperor's table. Constantine himself opened the council in a hall glittering with soldiers at attention and courtiers along the walls, and by every account he entered not in the purple of ceremony, but simply dressed, and sat only after the bishops had taken their places, a gesture of deference toward men, many of whom bore in their bodies the wounds of the very empire he now ruled. Nicholas came from Myra as one bishop among hundreds, without the fame that would gather around his name in later centuries, known in that room chiefly to those who had heard of the grain ships he had turned toward his starving city, or the 3 girls he had saved from a life of shame, with gold thrown through a window in the dark. He was not a metropolitan of one of the great seas. He held no office that made his voice carry further than any other bishop's, but he had a fire in him that had not cooled since the day the persecutors closed his cell. And when Arius rose in that hall and set out his teaching before the assembled fathers, laying out with practiced clarity his case that the Son was a creature exalted above all creatures, but not the eternal God, something in Nicholas that had survived chains and shipwreck and famine would not sit still. The debates went on for days, by every account bitter and technical and exhausting. Bishops arguing over single Greek words, over whether the Son was of the same essence as the Father, homousios, or merely of similar essence, homoousios. An argument so fine it was later mocked as a quarrel over a single letter of the alphabet, though every father in that room knew the whole of the gospel hung on which letter won. It was in the midst of this, the argument circling, Arius pressing his case again with the same confident eloquence, the room heavy with heat and incense, and the memory of every persecution these men had survived, for the sake of the very doctrine now being reasoned away in polished sentences, that Nicholas could bear it no longer. He crossed the floor, he struck Arius across the face. It was, by the standards of any council before or since, an unthinkable breach. Whatever grief burned in him, whatever righteous fury moved his hand, a bishop does not strike a priest in the presence of the emperor and the assembled fathers of the whole church and expect the act to pass without consequence. The hall that had rung with theological argument now rang with something else, the shock of violence in a sacred assembly, the scandal of a holy man's hand raised against another cleric. However grave the error, he answered. Constantine himself, presiding over a council he had summoned precisely to bring peace to a church torn by controversy, could not let the blow stand unanswered. The fathers moved at once. Nicholas was stripped there in the hall of the omophorion he wore as a bishop, and the gospel book he carried as a sign of his office, and he was led away and shut in a cell to await the council's judgment, a prisoner not of the empire this time, but of the church he had spent his whole life serving. Think of what that must have been for him. This was a man who had already spent years in an imperial dungeon for the name of Christ, who had come through fire and hunger and the sea's own violence, and never once, so far as any account tells us, wavered or complained. And now he sat in a cell again, not because a pagan magistrate had judged him an enemy of Rome, but because the fathers of his own church, men he had suffered beside, had judged that his zeal, however justly provoked, had broken the order and dignity of a sacred council. There is a particular grief in that kind of imprisonment, harder in some ways than the persecutor's cell, because there is no enemy to blame for it, no empire to rage against, only your own hand, and the silence of men who love you and cannot excuse what you have done. It is here that the tradition of the church gives us the second half of this story, and it is the half that makes the first half bearable, and more than bearable, it makes it holy. That night, alone in the cell, stripped of the very signs of his episcopate, Nicholas was visited. The Lord Christ himself appeared to him, holding out the gospel book that had been taken from his hands, and beside him stood the Mother of God, holding the omophorion that had been stripped from his shoulders. Neither Christ nor his mother rebuked him. They restored to him, in that cell, the very vestments of his office that the council had removed. And in doing so they answered, in the one court that finally matters, the question the fathers of Nicaea had not yet resolved. The zeal that had moved his hand was not the zeal of a man who loved his own righteousness. It was recognized in that hidden hour as the zeal of a man who loved Christ more than his own dignity, more than the good opinion of his brother bishops, more even than his freedom to walk out of that cell as anything other than a man broken by the council he had served. In the morning, so the tradition tells, the guards came to check on their prisoner, and found him vested once more in the omophorion, and holding the gospel book, the very garments that had been locked away from him. Word of it reached the fathers, and reached Constantine, and the council that had judged Nicholas the day before now understood that a judgment higher than their own had already been rendered. He was restored to his place among the bishops. Whatever penance the council may have asked of him for the breach of its order, he did not leave Nicaea in disgrace. He left it vindicated, not because a blow struck in anger is ever, in itself, something to imitate, but because the fire that produced it was recognized by Christ himself as the fire of a true shepherd defending his flock against a wolf dressed as a teacher. The council itself, in the end, gave the whole church the words it needed. Out of those weeks of argument came the creed that is still prayed every Sunday in every church that holds the apostolic faith. East and west alike, the Son declared to be true God from true God, begotten not made, of one essence with the Father, through whom all things were made. Arius and his teaching were condemned. The bishops who would not sign the creed were, with a very few exceptions, a small remnant beside the great weight of the Fathers, who put their names to it. Constantine had his unity, at least for a season. The Arian controversy would smoulder on for decades after Nicaea closed its doors, flaring up again under emperors more sympathetic to Arius's cause, and the fight for Nicene orthodoxy would cost other men, Athanasius chief among them, decades of exile and hardship still to come. But the words were spoken, the line was drawn, and Nicholas of Myra, whatever his exact place in the long roll of signatories that history has only partly preserved for us, was there in that hall when it was drawn, and gave to it not only his voice, but for one unrepeatable moment, his whole body. It is worth sitting with why this story, of all the stories of Nicholas's life, is the one so many icons choose to paint. Walk into an Orthodox church that keeps the full cycle of his feast, and you may well find, among the scenes of the three daughters and the calming of the storm, a small panel showing a bishop with his hand raised against a cowering priest, and above them Christ and the Theotokos descending with book and omophorion in hand. It is not there to teach that anger is a virtue, or that a bishop may strike whom he pleases when doctrine is at stake. It is there because it holds together, in a single frozen instant, everything the Church once remembered about zeal for the truth, that it must come from a heart already proven in mercy, that it will cost the one who bears it dearly, but the world's courts, even the courts of bishops, may judge it wrongly before the truth of it is finally revealed, and that Christ himself will vindicate what was done for his sake, in his own time, in his own way, because that is the deeper truth this story guards. Nicholas did not strike Arius out of temper or spectacle. The man who gave gold through a window so that no one would know his name. The man who stood before an executioner's raised sword to save three condemned strangers he had never met and asked for no thanks, was not a man given to easy displays. What moved him at Nicaea was the same fire that had moved him in every other chapter of his life, a love for Christ so total that it could not sit quietly while Christ's own divinity was reasoned into something less. The gold in the window and the blow in the council hall come from the same hand, the same heart. One conceals itself in the dark so that mercy might do its work unseen. The other explodes into the light because some errors cannot be met with silence. Both are Nicholas. Both are the shape holiness takes when it is pressed hard enough by love. 17 centuries have passed since that summer in Bithynia, and the creed those fathers wrote is still prayed in Rome and in Constantinople, in Bari and in Moscow, in every parish that still confesses the Son as true God from true God. Arius is remembered as the man whose name gave the heresy its title and little else. But Nicholas is remembered for the blow, not because the Church wishes every believer to imitate the gesture, but because the Church wishes every believer to carry within them a fraction of what produced it. A love for Christ fierce enough to cost something, offered by a man whose whole life, examined from the cradle to that council floor, gives us no reason to doubt that the love was real. He left Nicaea and returned to Myra, to his grain stores and his prisoners and his three daughters long since married and safe, an old man now by the reckoning of his age, carrying in his body the scars of the persecution and, however briefly, the scar of a night spent stripped of his office in a cell of his own church's making. He would go on shepherding Myra for years yet, and the miracles that had marked his life on land would soon enough follow him onto the open sea, where sailors caught in storms off the Lycian coast would learn to call his name before they called on any other, and find, as three girls in the dark once found gold at their window, that the answer came. The ship goes over before it rights itself, and every man aboard braces for the second wave that will not let it rise again. This is the Mediterranean in its bad temper, the wind screaming down off the Lycian headlands, the mast groaning like something alive. The deck a sheet of black water no man can stand on without a rope in his fist. Sailors who have crossed from Egypt 100 times without incident know, in the particular way sailors know these things, that this crossing will not be like the others. Someone is weeping. Someone is praying to gods who have never once quieted a sea. And then someone, perhaps a man who has put in at Andriaca, the port below Myra, and heard the stories they tell there over wine about the bishop who feeds the harbor in famine and faces down soldiers in the street. Someone remembers a name. He shouts it into the wind, not as ritual but as the last thing he has left to shout. Nicholas, servant of God, if what they say of you is true, help us now. This is how the sea storm miracle begins in every telling the church has kept. Not with the saint volunteering himself, but with drowning men reaching for the only rope left in the water. And the church has always insisted on what came next. The wind did not merely fall. A man was seen among them, on the deck, at the ropes, in the rigging where no extra hand had stood a moment before, steadying the ship with a calm that had nothing frantic in it, working the lines like someone who had spent his boyhood, as Nicholas had, watching Lycian fishermen work theirs. The waves did not build to their final and fatal height. They broke instead, and kept breaking, until the black sky opened enough grey to steer by, and the ship that should have gone down off the Lycian coast that night came instead, battered and soaked and unbelieving, into the calm water of a harbor its crew had given up hope of ever seeing. Sailors talk. That is the first thing to understand about how the whole Mediterranean world came to know Nicholas of Myra as a name to shout into a gale. A merchant crew that survives a storm because a man appeared on their ropes does not keep that story to itself over the next 20 ports of call. They tell it in Alexandria, and they tell it in Antioch, and they tell it most of all in every harbor tavern, where sailors compare which saints answer and which do not. Long before there were icons of Nicholas holding a ship in his palm, there were men in wet clothes, describing, to anyone who would listen, exactly what they had seen on the worst night of their lives. The church did not invent the sailors' devotion to Nicholas. The sailors built it themselves, port by port, out of gratitude that had nowhere else to go. And this is the first shape the Wonderworker takes for the ordinary reader of this book to hold on to. He is the one who comes to people who have no other hand to grab. A ship going down at night has no advocate on shore, no official to petition, no letter to write. It is only the water closing over it, and whatever mercy still moves in that water. That mercy, the church has always taught, was not abstract. It had a face. It had hands that knew how to tie a line. It belonged to a bishop who, when he was a young man himself crossing to Egypt and to the Holy Land, had felt exactly that fear, and had learnt exactly what it was to call out into a night with no shore in sight. Myra itself gave the world the second of these three great rescues, and this one did not happen on the water at all. It happened in the marketplace, at midday, in front of the whole city. The governor of Lycia at that time was a man named Eustathius, and Eustathius had taken a bribe. 3 men of Myra, citizens with families, with no crime against them that the record has ever specified beyond the jealousy or greed of men more powerful than themselves, had been condemned to death on false charges, and the sentence was set to be carried out that day, in public, at the place where such things were done outside the city walls. The executioner had his sword raised, the 3 men knelt with their eyes already bound, past the point where pleading does any good, past the point where anyone expected rescue. This was the moment the story turns on. Not before, when an appeal might still have worked, but after, when the blade was already in the air, and gravity itself was the only thing left to happen. Nicholas arrived running. Word had reached him, how quickly the household of a bishop who is also the shepherd of the whole city hears of an execution about to proceed unjustly. And he came from wherever he had been, through the streets, past the guards who might in another circumstance have stopped him, straight to the place of execution while the sword was still descending. He put his hand on it. Not a word first, not a plea. his hand on the blade itself, stopping the strike before it landed, and then, only then, the accusation to the executioner and to the governor standing by, that this was innocent blood, and that it would not be shed while he stood there. Eustathius, confronted in front of the crowd he governed by a bishop who had physically stopped an execution with his own body between the sword and the condemned, did not have Nicholas arrested for it. He confessed instead. He admitted the bribe, admitted the false charge, and the three men who had knelt with their eyes bound and their necks bared walked back into Myra alive. It is worth sitting with what kind of courage this took, because the church has never asked its faithful to treat it as a pleasant folk tale. A bishop laying his hand on a raised sword in front of an armed executioner and an angry governor is a man staking his own life on the truth of what he is saying. Nicholas had already done this once before, in the marketplace, over bread. He does it again here, over blood. And the pattern the church wants its children to notice is exactly this, that the man who broke the bread merchant's fraud with his own authority is the same man who broke an executioner's grip with his own hands. Mercy in Nicholas of Myra was never a sentiment. It had a body. It moved. And it happened, as it turned out, in front of witnesses whose testimony would matter enormously later, though none of them knew that yet. Among the officials and soldiers stationed at Myra that day, or passing through it, were 3 imperial officers, men in the service of the Emperor Constantine himself, sent south on a mission to put down a rebellion stirring in Phrygia. Weather had delayed their fleet at Andriaca. They had come up to Myra in the meantime, as travelers do, and they had seen, with their own eyes, standing in that crowd, a bishop stop a sword in the air and shame a Roman governor into confessing a bribe in front of the whole city. Men who have seen that do not forget it. Whatever these 3 officers believed about the world before that afternoon, they left Myra believing something more about the reach of one bishop's God than they had believed when they arrived. They sailed on to Phrygia. They did their work there, restored order, as they had been sent to do, and they returned toward Constantinople expecting nothing more dramatic than the emperor's thanks. What they got instead was a trap laid by envy in the capital. The same engine that had nearly killed 3 innocent men in Myra now turning on 3 loyal officers who had done nothing but their duty. A prefect named Ablabius, bribed by men who wanted these officers ruined, brought false charges against them before Constantine himself, charges serious enough and delivered persuasively enough that the emperor believed them. The 3 men were seized, imprisoned and sentenced to death, their execution set for the following dawn. No appeal moved Constantine. No defense they offered was believed. They had gone from the emperor's confidence to a death sentence in the space of one poisoned conversation, and by nightfall they had nothing left to do but wait for morning in a Constantinople cell. It was in that cell that one of them, the record does not tell us which, remembered Myra. Remembered the crowd, the sword in the air, the bishop's hand closing over the blade, the governor confessing in front of everyone rather than face what he had become. If that had happened once, in a marketplace outside a small Lycian city, for 3 strangers with no claim on the bishop at all beyond being his fellow citizens, then perhaps it could happen again, here, in a cell in the capital of the empire, for 3 men who had at least stood as witnesses to that first mercy. They prayed to Nicholas that night the way the sailors had prayed to him in the storm. Not with confidence exactly, but with nothing else left to try. What happened next is one of the accounts the church tells with the most specific detail, because it happened not to the condemned men only, but to the 2 men who held their fate in their hands. That same night, Nicholas appeared to Emperor Constantine in a dream, not gently. He identified himself as Bishop of Myra and told the emperor, in terms that left no room for delay, that the 3 officers he intended to execute in the morning were innocent, and that he was to release them at once. Constantine woke disturbed by the vividness of it, the kind of dream a man does not simply shake off over breakfast. And that same night, in his own house, Ablabius the prefect, the very man who had taken the bribe and brought the false charge, received the same visitor, and this time the warning came with weight behind it. Release the men, or face the judgment of God for what his greed had set in motion. 2 men who had never shared each other's dream, waking in the same city on the same morning, with the same warning ringing in them, is not a coincidence the church has ever asked its faithful to explain away. Constantine summoned the prisoners himself before the day's execution could proceed, and asked them, directly, whether they knew a magician, the word he used, in his uncertainty about what kind of power had visited him in the night, named Nicholas. When they answered that they knew no magician, but that they knew a bishop of that name in Myra, whom they had seen, with their own eyes, stop an unjust execution with his bare hand, Constantine had his answer. The charges were dropped, the 3 officers were freed, restored to the emperor's confidence, and sent south again, this time not to suppress a rebellion, but to carry to the Bishop of Myra the emperor's own gratitude and gifts. In thanks for a rescue Nicholas had worked from hundreds of miles away, in the middle of the night, without ever leaving his sleep. Set these 2 rescues side by side, and the shape of the man becomes unmistakable. In Myra he saved 3 innocent citizens with his own hand, in the open street, at the cost of confronting a Roman governor to his face. In Constantinople he saved 3 innocent officers with no hand at all, only a dream sent into the sleep of an emperor who had never met him, and a prefect whose guilt he named without ever standing in the room. Distance did not matter to him, rank did not matter to him, a governor in one story, an emperor in the other, both bent by a bishop who held neither office nor army. What mattered, every time, was simply this: someone innocent was about to die, and no one on earth was going to stop it in time. The 3rd rescue asks even more of the reader's trust, because it is the darkest of the 3, and the Church has never softened it to make it easier to hear. Somewhere along the roads of Lycia, during a season of famine so severe that even good men were driven to terrible things, 3 young boys were traveling, pilgrims or students on their way to further schooling, the kind of boys any parent might have sent off trusting the roads and the inns along them. They stopped for the night at the house of a man who kept an inn, or ran a butcher's trade, and who had, under the pressure of that famine, discovered a way to turn hunger into profit that no decent man could imagine until it was described to him plainly. He killed the 3 boys in the night. He cut them apart and salted the pieces in a brine tub in his cellar, meaning, in a town starved enough to ask no questions of meat offered cheap, to sell what remained of them as food. It is Nicholas, travelling that road not long after, who perceived what had happened. The Church has always taught this as a matter of spiritual sight, the same discernment that would let him find Arius's error at Nikos Inding, here a crime hidden in a cellar that no ordinary inquiry would have uncovered. He went to the house. He confronted the man directly, and the innkeeper, faced with a bishop who somehow already knew, broke and confessed everything: the murder, the brine tub, the whole horror of it laid bare in his own words. Nicholas did not stop at exposing the crime. He went down to the cellar himself, to the tub where 3 children had been reduced to salted remains awaiting a buyer, and there he prayed, not a plea for justice this time, not an appeal against a sentence, but a plea for life itself, spoken over what should by every law of nature have been beyond restoring. And the 3 boys rose out of that tub whole, not healed of wounds, restored entirely, as though the knife and the brine had never touched them, given back to whatever family had sent them off trusting the road. This is the miracle parents have carried in their hearts for over 1,000 years, and it is not hard to understand why. Sailors have a saint who comes to them in a storm, because sailors know exactly what it is to have no shore in sight. Condemned men have a saint who comes to them at the foot of the sword, because they know exactly what it is to have exhausted every appeal. But children who trust an adult's roof over their heads and have no power at all to protect themselves from what that adult decides to do in the night, need a saint most of all. And Nicholas is given to them entire, not a comforting word after the fact. Not vengeance on the guilty, though the guilty did not go unjudged. Life itself, called back out of a tub of brine by a bishop who happened, providentially, to be walking that road at just that hour. 3 rescues, 3 kinds of helplessness, and the same hand behind every one of them. A hand that once, as a boy, learnt to fold coins into a poor man's window without waiting to be thanked. The sailors could not have saved themselves. The 3 citizens under the sword could not have talked their way free. The 3 officers in a Constantinople cell had exhausted every appeal an emperor's court allowed. The 3 boys had no power at all, not even the power to run. And into every one of those impossible situations, at 4 different distances from Myra, in 4 different kinds of darkness, the same bishop arrived, sometimes on foot, sometimes only in a dream, but always in time, and always for someone who had no one else. The old man died the way he had lived, without ceremony, without an audience gathered to hear something quotable. It was the 6th of December, in the year long remembered as 343, and by then Nicholas had worn out an entire generation of Myra's citizens with his stubborn habit of outliving their expectations of him. He had buried bishops younger than himself. He had stood through Diocletian's prisons and Constantine's council, through famine years and a riot he'd broken with his own body thrown between the mob and the condemned. Now, in a small room within his own episcopal house, surrounded by the clergy he had ordained, and the deacons who had learnt the Psalter under his voice, he closed his eyes on Myra, for the last time. There was no final oration. The record does not give us his last words, and this house will not invent them. What it gives us instead is simpler and, in its way, more moving. An old shepherd, having spent every strength God gave him on people who could not repay him, spent his last breath the same way, in prayer, unwitnessed except by the few who loved him enough to be there. They buried him in the cathedral church of Myra, the same church where he had broken the bread for his people every week for decades, where the widows had come with their empty hands, and the fishermen had come reeking of the harbor, and no one had ever been told to wait outside. They laid him in a marble sarcophagus, plain by the standards of the age, no gold leaf, no imperial trappings, nothing that would have looked out of place beside the humblest grave in Lycia. It was fitting. He had given away too much gold in his lifetime to be buried under any of it now. The Archbishop of Myra and Lycia went into the ground the way he had walked through the streets above it, as one of his own people, indistinguishable in death from the poor he had loved in life, except that everyone in that church that day understood exactly whose grave it was. Grief, however, is not always a private thing, and Myra's did not stay contained within its own walls for long. Word travels along a coastline the way water travels, following the lowest paths, finding every gap. Within a few years, pilgrims were coming down from the Taurus foothills and up from the fishing towns along the Lycian shore, arriving at the cathedral not merely to mourn but to ask. They knelt at the sarcophagus the way they had once queued at his door. The sick, the frightened, the falsely accused, the parents of children in trouble far from home. And they did not leave disappointed. The tomb of the Wonderworker of Myra behaved exactly as his life had behaved. It kept giving. Cures were reported. Sailors caught in storms off the Lycian coast swore they had called his name, and felt the wind answer. Mothers who had lost children to fever came home with children who had not died after all. None of this surprised the clergy who tended his tomb. They had watched him work miracles while his own heart was still beating. Why would death be the one obstacle strong enough to stop him? Then came the sign that no one in Myra had precedent for, though within a generation it would be spoken of across the whole of Christian Anatolia and, eventually, the whole of Christian Europe. A fragrance began to fill the church, not incense, not the myrrh burned in the censer during the liturgy, but something that seemed to rise from the sarcophagus itself, sweet and unaccountable, filling the nave on ordinary days when no feast called for it. And then the fragrance became substance. A clear, faintly golden liquid began to gather at the base of the tomb, seeping from the stone itself, collecting in enough quantity that the clergy began gathering it in small vials to give to the pilgrims who begged for it. They called it manna, borrowing the word from the wilderness bread that had fed Israel, because like that bread no one could explain where it came from, only that it did not stop, and that it fed something in the people who received it. Pilgrims carried the manna of St. Nicholas home in stoppered glass, anointed the sick with it, drank it mixed with water for fevers that medicine in that age had no other answer for. Priests who examined the phenomenon skeptically came away convinced. The tomb of a man who had spent his whole life pouring out what he had, gold through a window, grain from a famine ship, mercy on the necks of 3 condemned soldiers, was, in death, still pouring. It has never, in all the centuries since, entirely stopped. For 700 years the sarcophagus stayed where the church of Myra had first laid it, and the myrrh flowed, and pilgrims came, and the Church of the East kept his feast on the 6th of December with the particular tenderness reserved for a bishop who was also a father. But the world around that quiet Lycian church was not standing still, and by the 11th century the coastline Nicholas had once patrolled by boat, feeding starving towns from a merchant ship's hold, had fallen on hard times that had nothing to do with famine and everything to do with armies. Arab raiding fleets had been striking the southern Anatolian coast since the 7th century, and Myra, once a harbour city with a busy port at Andriake below it, had shrunk under repeated assault until the silt of its own river had begun to bury the old wharves, the way time buries everything it is given long enough. Then, in 1071, the catastrophe at Manzikert broke the Byzantine defensive line across Asia Minor entirely, and Seljuk forces began moving through territory the empire could no longer reliably hold. Myra, by the 1080s, was a diminished town under a diminished and uncertain protection, its great cathedral standing over a treasure that increasingly few soldiers were left to guard. Word of this reached Italy the way word of miracles once reached Anatolia, traveling the sea lanes, carried by merchants and sailors who moved between the two worlds constantly, and who had, many of them, their own devotion to the Wonderworker already fixed deep in their hearts. In the port city of Bari, on the Adriatic coast of southern Italy, that devotion met with a very practical fear, that the saint whose bones had fed a Christian people's hope for 7 centuries might now fall under a domination that would not honor them, might be scattered or lost, or simply left to crumble under neglect, while the world's attention turned elsewhere. Whether the greater motive in Bari's harbour that spring was piety, civic ambition, or some inseparable mixture of both, the record does not let us settle cleanly. Men rarely have only one reason for anything, saints included. What is certain is what they decided to do about it. In the spring of 1087, a company of Berenzi sailors set out for Myra, sailing under the cover of ordinary trade, merchants among merchants, nothing in their rigging to announce that they had come for anything but grain or oil. When they reached the ruined harbour below the city and made their way up to the cathedral, they found the tomb of Nicholas still standing, still guarded, tended now by only a small company of monks left to keep watch over a shrine the wider Christian world seemed, from where those monks stood, to have forgotten. What passed between the Beresta sailors and the guardians of the tomb was not a peaceful handover. There was resistance. There were words exchanged that no chronicle preserves faithfully enough for us to quote, and in the end the sailors broke into the sarcophagus themselves, working quickly, aware that the town around them could turn against them the moment word spread of what was happening inside the cathedral walls. What they found inside the broken tomb was not dry bone. The relics of Nicholas lay submerged, or nearly so, in the same fragrant myrrh that had been collecting there for 7 centuries. The manor had not stopped for the men come to take him away any more than it had stopped for the widows who had come to be healed. The sailors gathered what they had come for, wrapped it, and carried it back down to their ship before the town of Myra fully understood what had been taken from it. They put out to sea, and Lycia, the province that had shaped him from a boy in Patara to an old bishop dying in his own cathedral, watched the last physical remnant of its Wonderworker sail west, toward a people who had never seen his face, but who already, in some sense the church has never found strange, belonged to him. The voyage home was not long, and the ships of Bari made port on the 9th of May, 1087, to a welcome the town had clearly been praying for even before it knew it would be granted. Word had run ahead of the ships along the coast, and by the time they reached the harbour the quays were already filling with people who had heard, impossibly fast, that the Wonderworker of Myra was coming to Bari to stay. The relics were carried ashore in procession, through streets that had likely never held a crowd so large for any single event in the town's history, to a temporary resting place while the city set about building something worthy of what it had received. That building became the Basilica di San Nicola, raised over the following years directly above the crypt where the relics were finally, permanently enshrined. A Latin church built in the Romanesque style of southern Italy to house a Greek bishop from the far coast of Lycia. An image, if you want one, of exactly how wide the family of Christ actually runs. Pope Urban II himself came to Bari to preside at the crypt's consecration a few years later, placing the relics beneath the altar with his own hands, and from that day the translation of the relics, the 9th of May, entered the calendar of the wider church as its own feast, celebrated in Bari, in the Christian East, and eventually across a Christianity far larger than either Myra or Bari could have imagined containing him. And the myrrh did not stay behind in Lycia either. Almost immediately, pilgrims in Bari began reporting the same fragrant liquid gathering in the new crypt that had gathered in the old cathedral, the manor of Saint Denis. Nicholas making the crossing along with the bones that produced it, as though grace itself had simply changed address. To this day, on the vigil of his feast, the clergy of the Basilica di San Nicola draw the myrrh from the tomb and distribute it to the faithful who still come from every part of the world, asking the same things Myra's poor once asked at his open door: healing, protection, an intercessor who has never, in any century anyone can document, stopped listening. It is worth sitting for a moment with what actually happened here, because it is easy to tell this story as an ending. A great man dies, is buried, is later moved, and miss that it is not an ending at all. Long before those Bari sailors ever loaded a ship, Nicholas's name was already being invoked in languages he never spoke, in churches he never saw built, by sailors on seas he never sailed. His cult had reached the Kievan Rus and the Norman kingdoms and the trading cities of the Aegean, while his bones still lay quietly in Lycian soil, because a life spent giving without needing to be thanked has a way of outrunning its own grave. The translation to Bari did not create his presence in the West. It made visible, in stone and crypt and fragrant oil, what had already become true in 10,000 hearts that had never once seen his face. He was buried in Myra. He was, by 1087, already everywhere, and Bari simply gave the world a place to stand and be near him. The lamp before his tomb in that Bari crypt has not gone out since the day it was consecrated. Pilgrims still descend the worn stone steps to kneel where the myrrh gathers, the way pilgrims once knelt in a cathedral above a harbour now silted shut, the way you yourself may kneel one day if the roads ever carry you there. The bishop who spent his whole life quietly giving where no one was watching him give is, in his tomb, still exactly that man, still generous, still unwilling to hoard even his own presence, still finding a way to reach whoever comes looking for him. wherever on the earth they happened to be standing. In the year 565, in the reign of the Emperor Justinian, a church rose in Constantinople, dedicated to the holy hierarch of Myra. Barely 2 centuries had passed since Nicholas closed his eyes in that small Lycian city by the sea, and already the capital of the Christian world had raised him a house. Justinian did not build for a folk hero. He built for a saint whose intercession the empire already trusted, whose name was already spoken over the sick, the imprisoned, the drowning. By the time Constantinople gave way to devotion, the devotion itself was old news. It had been growing quietly for generations, carried by sailors who told what he had done for their ships, by mothers who told what he had done for their sons, by bishops who told what he had done at Nicaea for the faith itself. This is the strange, glad fact about Nicholas. He did not need centuries to become beloved. He was beloved almost at once, and the belovedness never stopped moving. It moved east into the Slavic lands, west along the trade roads of Lombardy and Lorraine, north along the Rhine, and finally across an ocean to a harbour town the Dutch called New Amsterdam, where something happened to him that no Wonderworker before or since has had to endure. He was made into Santa Claus. To understand how the fisherman's Bishop of Myra became a fat man in a red suit at the North Pole, and to understand why the church never let go of the real man, even as the world reshaped his image into something almost unrecognizable, we have to follow the road he traveled, a road stranger than any of his sea rescues, and in its own way a wonder of its own. Byzantium loved him first, and loved him with the full weight of its liturgical imagination. The 6th of December was fixed early as his feast, the day, by the church's reckoning, of his falling asleep in the Lord, and hymnography multiplied around it. The Byzantine canon for his feast calls him a rule of faith and an icon of gentleness, language that would be repeated, translated, and echoed in 100 tongues for 1,000 years. Byzantine iconographers gave him a face, high forehead, close white beard, the omophorion of a bishop draped over his shoulders, the gospel book in his left hand and his right raised in blessing. That icon, the Nicholas of Myra icon, became, next to the icons of Christ and the Theotokos, the most reproduced sacred image in the Christian East. Walk into any Orthodox church from Thessaloniki to Anchorage today, and you will find him on the iconostasis, usually near the north or south door, exactly where a bishop belongs, guarding the entrance to the sanctuary he served all his life. From Constantinople, the devotion moved north with the gospel itself. In 988, Prince Vladimir of Kiev accepted baptism and brought his people into the Byzantine church, and Nicholas came with the baptismal water. The Russians did not merely venerate him, they took him in as one of their own. He became, within a few generations, the most beloved saint in the Russian calendar, after the Mother of God herself, addressed in the old affectionate diminutive as Nicola, patron of travellers, of the harvest, of the poor, of prisoners, of every soul caught in a hard passage. Russian peasants kept his icon in the Krasny Ugol, the beautiful corner of the home reserved for the holiest images, often alongside the Theotokos and no one else. They kept 2 feasts for him where the Greeks kept one, Nicola Zimni, Winter Nicholas, on the 6th of December, and Nicola Vesni, Spring Nicholas, in May, marking the transfer of his relics to Bari, a feast the Russian church kept with its own solemnity, even though the relics themselves had gone west. It is a small, telling fact. Russia mourned the departure of his body from Myra and rejoiced in it at once, because they understood, as the whole church understood, that Bari's gain was not Myra's loss, but the world's inheritance. In the west, the same expansion was happening by a different road. The translation of the relics in 1087 made Bari itself a new Myra, a harbour city suddenly holding the treasure that half of Christendom wanted to touch. Pilgrims came down through Italy, from Germany, from France, from England. Norman sailors who had carried the relics in the first place carried his cult back out along their trade routes into Sicily and southern France. And in Lorraine, in the eastern reaches of the old Carolingian world, a single relic, a knuckle of the saint's finger, brought back from a crusade by a knight of the region, became the seed of one of medieval Europe's great pilgrimage shrines. The town that grew up around it took his name outright, St. Nicholas de Port. The Dukes of Lorraine made him their patron. School children across the duchy were taught his story before they were taught their letters, and each December the 6th became, for the whole region, a day of processions, bell ringing, and gifts for the young, the first clear sign, on western soil, of a custom that would one day cross an ocean and change beyond recognition. Because that is what happened next, and it happened along the Rhine and through the Low Countries, where the folk memory of Nicholas fused most completely with the practice of gift-giving. The reason was never a mystery to the people who kept the custom. It was the three daughters, told and retold in every language the cult touched. A bishop who threw gold through a window in the dark of night, asking no thanks and leaving no name, was not a story that stayed still in people's imaginations. It became a practice. On the eve of his feast, the 5th of December, children across the Netherlands and the German-speaking lands set out their shoes, sometimes filled with hay or a carrot for the good bishop's white horse, and woke on the 6th to find them filled with sweets, small coins, sometimes chocolate coins, stamped with his image, a direct and deliberate echo of the gold he had thrown through a poor man's window centuries before. The Dutch shortened his title, St. Nicholas, into the familiar Sinterklaas, and by the 16th century he was as fixed a figure in Dutch domestic life as any saint in Christendom, metered, robed, riding his white horse over the rooftops with a book in which the deeds of the year's children were recorded, exactly as a bishop keeps the register of his flock. It was Dutch colonists who carried Sinterklaas across the Atlantic to the settlement they founded on the southern tip of Manhattan Island, New Amsterdam, in the early 1600s. When the English took the colony and renamed it New York, the Dutch families kept their saint in their homes, even as the language around them changed to English. For a century and a half he lived quietly there, a family custom rather than a public one, until two very different writers picked him up and, without quite meaning to, began the work of turning a bishop into a legend the whole English-speaking world would come to recognize. The first was Washington Irving, who in 1809 published a satirical mock history of New York under the pen name Diedrich Knickerbocker. Irving's Sinterklaas was a literary invention as much as a memory, pipe smoking, sliding down chimneys, riding not a horse but a wagon through the sky, and the book was meant as comedy, a gentle poke at old Dutch New York rather than a work of devotion. But comedy has its own power to fix an image in the public mind, and Irving's Sinterklaas planted a seed that grew faster than he could have guessed. The second was Clement Clark Moore, a professor of biblical languages in New York, who in 1823 wrote a poem for his children that began, "'Twas the night before Christmas, when all through the house." Moore's poem, properly titled, "A Visit from Saint Nicholas," gave the figure a sleigh, 8 named reindeer, a round belly that shook like a bowl full of jelly, and a chimney entrance that would become the standard route for every version afterward. Moore had moved the visit from the eve of December 6th to the eve of December 25th, folding the old Nicholas custom into the newer, and by then more culturally dominant, celebration of Christmas Day itself. It was a small shift in the poem, a single date changed, but it was the hinge on which the whole later transformation turned. Once Nicholas's night of gift-giving became Christmas Eve instead of his own feast, the figure was no longer anchored to the church's calendar at all. He floated free, available for anyone to reshape. And reshaped he was. In the decades after the Civil War, the political cartoonist Thomas Nast drew the figure for Harper's Weekly, issue after issue, giving him a wife, a workshop, a list of names, a home at the North Pole among elves and toys, building out, in ink, an entire mythology that owed almost nothing to Myra and almost everything to American imagination. By the early 20th century, advertisers had discovered him too. A soft drink company's Christmas illustrations in the 1930s fixed the red and white suit in the public mind so completely that most people now assume it was always that color, though nothing in the Dutch or German tradition, let alone the Byzantine icon, ever dressed him so. What had begun as a bishop's omophorin had become a fur-trimmed coat. What had begun as a gospel book had become a sack of toys. What had begun as the sober record of an orphan's confirmand years, a desert monk's silence, a council's fury against heresy, had become, for most of the watching world, a cheerful old man who exists for exactly one night a year and asks nothing of anyone but a cookie left on a plate. It would be easy, standing at this distance, to grieve the loss and stop there, to see only what the centuries stripped away, the mitre, the vestments, the fasting, the fire at Nicaea, the years of episcopal grief for a starving city, the blow struck for the divinity of Christ. All of that is gone from the modern Santa Claus, and none of it should be pretended otherwise. But something else is true as well. Something the church has never forgotten, even while the world built its department store version around a name it no longer connected to a bishop's tomb. The name survived. Through every reshaping, every commercial repackaging, every generation further from Myra, the world kept calling this figure by his name, Nicholas. Not frost, not winter, not some invented spirit of the season. Nicholas, the bishop's own name, still spoken by children in 100 languages on the one night of the year when even a secular culture still, however dimly, remembers that gifts are supposed to come from somewhere, from someone, given in secret and asked for nothing in return. That instinct, the instinct that a gift in the night means someone loved you enough to give it without being thanked, is the instinct of the three daughters' story itself, worn down by centuries of retelling but never quite erased. Santa Claus is what remains when a culture keeps the gesture and forgets the saint. It is the church's task, and has always been the Church's joy to remember the saint and restore the gesture to him. This is why, in Orthodox parishes from Athens to Anchorage to every corner the Russian diaspora settled, the 6th of December is still kept with full solemnity, a divine liturgy, the troparions sung in his honor, his icon carried in procession, his story told to children not as folklore, but as the record of a living man who is with Christ and still hears them when they pray. It is why, in Catholic parishes across Europe and increasingly in America, families have begun deliberately reclaiming the older custom, the eve of December 5th kept apart from Christmas Eve, shoes set on the windowsill or by the hearth, small gifts and chocolate coins left in them by parents who tell their children plainly, before Santa Claus ever enters the conversation, that this is the feast of a real bishop who once threw gold through a poor man's window in the dark, so that 3 sisters would not be sold into shame. Parishes in Lorraine still process to St. Nicholas de Port. Barry still fills every December with pilgrims who come not for a legend but for a tomb, a crypt, a flow of the manner of St. Nicholas that has not stopped for 900 years. Myra itself, Demre now, in modern Turkey, still holds the ruins of the church where he served as bishop, and pilgrims still walk its stones, still stand where he stood, still feel that the ground itself remembers him. 19½ centuries after his birth in Patara, the man who could not bear an empty granary or a heresy left unanswered is still, somehow, the figure every child on earth waits for on a winter night, even the children who have never heard his real name, even the cultures that swapped his mitre for a fur cap without asking his permission. The world took him and made something smaller of him, softer, safer, stripped of the fire and the fasting and the tears he shed for Myra's hungry, but it could not make him disappear, and the Church, which has always known the difference between the gift and the giver, keeps his true feast still, on the 6th of December, exactly as Constantinople kept it in the year 565, with the Gospel in his hand, the Omophorion on his shoulders, and the whole weight of his life, not just its warmest legend, held up before the world as something worth remembering rightly. That is the road from Myra to the North Pole and back again, a road that runs through Constantinople's basilicas and Kiev's icon corners, through Lorraine's shrine and a Dutch child's shoe, through a satirist's joke and a professor's bedtime poem and a cartoonist's ink, and a soda company's Christmas advertisement, arriving finally at a truth stranger than any of the detours, that after everything the centuries did to his image, the saint himself never actually left. He is still received in the liturgy on the 6th of December. He is still asked in the old prayers to remember sailors on rough water and prisoners in dark cells and children who have done nothing yet to deserve any gift at all. And in more homes each year than the world's shopping malls could ever count, families are quietly turning the story back toward Myra, teaching their children that before there was a red suit, there was a red Omophorion. Before there was a sleigh, there was a bishop's staff. Before there was a jolly stranger at the North Pole, there was a man who wept over Nicaea's heresy, who fed a starving city with his own hands, who could not sleep until 3 sisters were saved, and that this man, not his shadow, is the one still worth waiting for. The house in Patara is gone now, not the town, which still holds its ruins to the Lycian sun, but the house itself, the one with the window that faced the street. No stone marks where the sill stood, no plaque tells the pilgrim. Here, on 3 nights, a hand set down gold and drew back into the dark before anyone could see whose hand it was. You cannot go and stand where the young man stood, listening to his own heart, weighing whether to be seen. That house belongs now only to memory and to the Church, which has never once let it go. But you have stood there anyway, these last 8 chapters. You have felt the weight of the coins in the cloth, the cold of the sill under fingers that did not want thanks, only to give and disappear. You have knelt with a boy in Patara who was given to God before he was old enough to refuse the gift, and walked with a young man through desert silence, and a sea that nearly swallowed him, learning in both the same lesson, that God is not absent in the hard places, only quiet, waiting to be recognized. You have watched a bishop empty the granaries of Myra, rather than watch his people starve, and stood dumbstruck, the way the fathers at Nicaea were dumbstruck, while a hand rose and fell against the face of a heretic, because some errors are not opinions to be weighed, but wounds to Christ's own body. And love, real love, does not always look gentle when the truth is under attack. You have watched sailors call his name into a black sea and find the wind obey. You have stood outside a tomb in Myra that could not hold what it held, watched myrrh bead on marble long after the bones themselves were carried west to Bari in the spring of 1087, watched a whole city turn out with candles to receive a saint they had never met in the flesh and would never stop meeting in the spirit. You have followed him, finally, into your own century, into the pocket of a child's coat, the quiet of a Christmas Eve, the small solemn strangeness of shoes set out by a hearth in hope. That is the portrait. 9 chapters, 1 window, 1 gold coin catching lamplight, and around it, a life. But a portrait, however true, is not the whole man. A portrait shows you a face turned toward the light for a single held moment. It cannot show you every year of the sitting, every silence between the strokes, every hour the painter spent simply looking before he dared lift the brush. What you have read here is real. Every scene in this book is drawn from the Church's own memory of her Wonderworker. Nothing invented, nothing softened, but it is real, the way a single window is real in a house of many rooms. You have seen the light come through. You have not yet walked the halls. That is where the 3 volumes wait. They are not sequels in the way a novel has sequels, one adventure spilling into the next. They are 3 long, unhurried looks at 3 inseparable truths about the same man. Each volume a room in the house this short book has only let you glimpse through glass. Read together. They are the fullest life of St. Nicholas of Myra, that devotion and history can offer a reader today. Read on their own. Each still stands complete, a whole meal, not a course. The first volume is the child formed by grace. It opens not with a bishop already made, already mitred and staffed and ready for the icon, but with an infant in Patara whose very first hours, the Church remembers, bore the mark of something set apart. A nursing child who would not take milk on the appointed fast days of the week, as though his small body already understood what his mind could not yet choose. This volume lingers where the short chapters here could only gesture. The household of his parents, Epiphanius and Nonna, prosperous and devout, and tradition holds, taken by plague or fever while Nicholas was still young, leaving him heir to a fortune he would spend before he ever wore a bishop's ring. It follows him to the Holy Land, walking the ground Christ walked, praying in Gethsemane, standing perhaps at the very door of the empty tomb, a pilgrimage any devout Christian of Lycia might have made, but one that seems, in Nicholas's case, to have burned something permanent into him, a hunger for the desert silence, and beneath that hunger, a stronger pull toward people, toward the city, toward the poor who could not travel to find God because God would have to come and find them instead. The volume follows his time in ascetic solitude and his sea voyage toward Myra, the storm that nearly took him and every soul aboard the ship, until a voice was called on and the wind obeyed. It closes with a vacancy in the Sea of Myra, an old bishop's synod uncertain whom to choose, and a story the Church has told for 17 centuries, of a young man led by a dream, arriving at the cathedral doors before dawn to pray, and being met there by the very bishops seeking a sign of whom God had chosen. This is the volume for the reader who wants to understand the making of the man before the mitre, the boy given to God before he could choose it, and what he chose, again and again, once he was old enough to choose for himself. The second volume is the bishop who would not break. It takes up where the first leaves off, with Nicholas newly seated in the cathedral of Myra, and it does not let him rest there in peace for long, because the church he served did not know peace for long. This is the volume of persecution. The years under Diocletian and Galerius when to be a bishop in Lycia was to carry a death sentence over your own head every day you continued to say the liturgy. When Nicholas himself, the tradition holds, was imprisoned, chained, perhaps tortured, for refusing to hand over the scriptures or bow to the emperor's gods. It is the volume of the famine, told here in a single chapter, but unfolded there across the full breadth of what it meant for a bishop to go personally to merchant ships bound for Constantinople and Alexandria, to beg and bargain and shame grain captains into unloading a portion of their cargo at Myra's harbour, feeding a starving province on nothing but the force of his own persuasion, and God's providence working through it. And at the volume's centre stands the year 325, and the city of Nicaea, and the great council Constantine summoned to settle, once and for all, whether the Son was truly God or merely God's first and finest creature. This volume gives you the whole council in a way one chapter never could. The emperor's arrival, the assembled bishops, many of them bearing in their own bodies the scars of the persecution just ended, the arguments of Arius and the fire that rose in Nicholas as he listened to Christ's divinity, reasoned away in polished, reasonable words. It gives you the blow, the strike across Arius's face that the tradition remembers Nicholas delivering, not from a failure of self-command but from a love for Christ, too total to sit still before blasphemy. And it gives you what followed, his removal from the council floor by the shocked fathers, the vision granted him in his confinement of Christ handing him the gospel, and the Theotokos placing the Amaphorion on his shoulders, and his restoration to his seat, and his voice among the very bishops who signed the creed that still, today, every Sunday, in every divine liturgy and every Latin Mass, calls the Son homousios with the Father. This is the volume for the reader who wants to understand that Nicholas's tenderness toward children and sailors and the poor was never softness. It came from the same fire that could not let a lie about his Lord stand unanswered. The third volume is the saint who never stopped coming to his people. It begins where an ordinary biography would end, at Nicholas's death, on the 6th of December, likely in the year 343, in the city he had shepherded for decades, and it shows you, chapter by chapter, why the Church has never once treated that date as a closing. It gathers the wonders worked through him in life, the ones this short book could only sample. The 3 daughters saved from a father's despair, and a life of shame by 3 secret gifts of gold. The storm calmed at sea when sailors, watching death come for them, called on a bishop they had perhaps only heard of by reputation, and found him somehow present with them in their peril. The falsely accused men spared execution at the last possible moment, because Nicholas arrived, staff in hand, and stayed the executioner's sword with his own arm. It gathers too the wonders worked after his death, the sweet-smelling myrrh that began, almost at once, to gather at his tomb in Myra, still flowing today from his relics in Barry, gathered each May 9th by the clergy there, and carried out to the faithful as tangible evidence that grace did not stop at his grave. It tells the full story of the translation of the relics in 1087, sailors from Barry, aware that Myra lay under Saracen control, and the tomb was vulnerable, removing his bones by night and carrying them west, not as theft but as a scattering of grace, the whole Church would come to receive as providence, since it placed the Wonderworker's body at the crossing point of East and West, where Greek and Latin Christians alike could kneel before him. And it follows him further still, into the folk memory of the Rhineland and the Low Countries, into Sinterklaas and the Dutch ships that carried that name to New Amsterdam, into the long, slow, sad drift by which a bishop's feast became a red-suited myth stripped of his crozier and his gospel and his fire for Christ. This volume does not scold the reader for loving Santa Claus as a child. It simply insists, gently and then firmly, that the truth is so much larger and so much better. Not a man who lives at the North Pole, but a man who lives in the nearer presence of Christ, and who has never once stopped listening for the voice of a child, a sailor, a prisoner, a parent at the end of hope, calling his name. 3 volumes then, 1 life, a child formed by grace who did not choose his calling but grew, year by year, into someone who could not have chosen otherwise. A bishop who fed a starving city with his own hands, and would not let a whisper against his Lord pass unanswered in the halls of an ecumenical council. A saint who, 12 centuries after his bones crossed the sea to Barry, still turns toward every window where someone kneels in the dark, wondering if anyone is listening. You do not need all 3 to love him. You have loved him, perhaps, since childhood. Without knowing his name was more than a story told each December. This short book was written so that the name might become a face, and the face a friend, and the friend someone you might actually ask, in your own words, for help. If that has already happened somewhere in these 9 chapters, if you have found yourself, without quite deciding to, saying his name the way you would say the name of someone you trust, then the portrait has done what a portrait is for. But a friend, once made, is not meant to stay a stranger in every other room of his life. Somewhere ahead of you, whenever you are ready, the boy in Patara is waiting to be known more fully, and the bishop at Nicaea, and the Wonderworker whose myrrh still gathers at Bari every 9th of May. The doorway is open. It has been open for 17 centuries. Walk through it whenever you like, this year, next Advent, or on some ordinary afternoon when his name simply comes to mind, and will not leave. Until then, take this much with you, and let it be enough for tonight. A gold coin in a dark window, given by a hand that wanted no thanks but God's, and a voice, older than the story itself, that has never stopped saying to the frightened, the poor, and the lost, do not be afraid, I am here. Holy Father Nicholas, Wonderworker of Myra, pray for us, and for all who have read this far seeking your face. Amen.